Are Americans an angry people, or is it that at this point in our history, they have become wrathful in response to what they perceive to be unresolved compromises in our electoral processes, wrathful against big tech corporate elites, progressive elites, and political actors who condescend to them and eviscerate them of their dignity in many ways? And what is the difference between anger and wrath? And do both, when expressed in heightened forms, run the risk of undermining the social cohesion and civic trust which undergird our republic? Is unleashed wrathful anger fundamentally a moral issue or a psychological issue? And how do we differentiate between the old restrained anger and the angry culture of today? At what point did the taboo surrounding unrestrained anger dissipate, leaving many free to see anger as an important aspect not only of their authentic identities, but as a genuine mode of self-actualization? My guest and I will be looking for answers to these questions and many more questions regarding this most vexing emotion. This is The Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. My guest today is Dr. Peter Wood, who is president of the National Association of Scholars, a former professor of anthropology and college provost. And he's the author of several books, including 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project, which was published in 2020, and other books about American culture, including Diversity, the Invention of a Concept, Bee in the Mouth, Anger in America Now, Diversity Rules, and his most interesting recent book called Wrath, America Engaged, published by Encounter Books. Dr. Wood, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I must say from the start, I must say that I found your book to be a very moving one in the sense that it reads partially as a man who, while giving us a very rich account of anger historically and anger in the contemporary sense also, is someone who, in an ethical manner, is working through his own relationship to anger and wrath. So before we get to the very thorny issues that you so richly discuss in your book and talk about some general cultural issues, am I right in my appraisal? And if so, could you speak to it? Are you working through, in this book, your own relationship to anger and wrath?
I suppose I am. I have never regarded myself as an angry person. My temperament, the manner in which I speak, my relationships with people are not so much characterized by my own difficulty of containing my anger. I'm rather on the opposite side of the spectrum of someone who feels generally unable to express anger, although I've spent a lot of my life surrounded by angry people. So I'm not going to lie down on the psychiatrist's couch here, but my mother was an especially angry person. I've had angry people close to me in my life, and it has posed for me the problem of how to deal with other people's anger and what to do to try to find some constructive way to place my own feelings of resentment or discontent into play. So, of course, I'm a writer, so I get the opportunity to sit down with my feelings and think about them for a long time, which is rather different from what most people experience when they're aggravated and can turn immediately to some form of vibrant expression. I'm not a really vibrantly expressive person. I'm an introvert who simmers over things.
So it seems to me, if I'm hearing you correctly, that the book, in some sense, is a way of it's not a sublimated form of your own anger, but a way to work through the various ways in which anger itself as an emotion, and we'll get into this now, how we can make sense of it. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, well, I'm an Aristotelian by temperament and by nature, and anger does seem to have a moral upshot to it, right? It's useful as a response to injustices. In fact, in your book, you say that the absence of anger is an impairment. So what are some of the differences between wrath and anger?
Well, I start out the book trying to draw a fairly simple distinction between the two, of anger being something that says, how dare you ask me that question? Whereas wrath turns it up to something more like, I'll destroy you. It's moved beyond a sense of indignation to a sense of your imposition on me is so intolerable that I'm ready to turn to violence, or at least rhetorical violence, to respond to you. So the two things are certainly on the same spectrum of ire. The Aristotelian would say that anger is closer to the mean here. Wrath is where you have discarded the sense that you need to restrain your anger and channel it to some constructive purpose. Wrath thinks that the constructive purposes are now denied you, that you're outside the conventions of society, that your opportunity to express yourself or to bring your grievances to the table have been shunted aside, and you have nothing left but a kind of rebellion. That's wrath.
And your book, which is very, very historical, we're going to get to the historical sense when we talk about George Washington and his anger and the founding fathers. Your book is a very, very rich attempt to reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable emotions, anger on the one hand and wrath. So let me ask you this, Dr. Wood. Do you think that in our society, the transgressions that you've talked about that are have been sort of the afflictions afflicted against our citizenry, and people have a justified sense in feeling wrathful and angry, are we at a point in our society where anger is just not sufficient and wrath is psychologically a very understandable emotion that people are feeling in response to some of the injustices, some of the transgressions committed against them?
Wrath is sometimes justified, sometimes not. Understandable, probably always. It's understandable as the resort that people turn to when they think any other place to put their anger is going to result in being blockaded. Now, one distinction that I make between anger and wrath has to do with the kinds of anger that we have lately become accustomed to as part of our general discourse. I call it performative anger or new anger, this sense that anger is something that should be lived out in our daily experience, and you must pay attention to me because I'm angry. So it's a performative emotion. Wasn't always the case, and we can get back to that when we talk more about the history of it. But if you are performing your anger in a manner that is essentially waving a flag that says, look at me, I'm angry, and you must attend to my grievances, and the people that you're trying to address simply turn their backs on you, then the opportunity to escalate to something more like wrath is inviting. The world in which we turn to wrath, however, doesn't justify all wrath. Sometimes the anger that we feel is based on illusions, mistakes. We are driven to a sense of overwhelming anger out of little more than our own pride or our own readiness to escalate. So that kind of wrath is a rather destructive thing. Now, I don't necessarily want to go directly into historical detail, but as an anthropologist, I'm always ethnographic about these things. When I think that the Black Lives Matter movement was out burning cities in the summer of 2020, that's certainly an expression of wrath, at least on the part of many of the participants. Was it justified? I think not. Was it understandable? Yes, that people had worked themselves to a pitch of rage that called for public violence against not only buildings but other people, strikes me as highly unjustifiable. But I'm also ready to say that the wrath felt by people who believed that the 2020 election was stolen, and I'm among those people, is something that is justified in that we found the agencies of the federal government were being deployed to prevent any discussion at all of what our grievances were. Faced with a mass media, think of the New York Times describing every expression of doubt about the integrity of the election as the great lie. All of that was to bottle people up, saying your anger is so unjustified that you probably deserve to be arrested and incarcerated for even saying that you were in doubt about an election. That was to blockade the exits. The anger that could have been expressed and dealt with in the public forum was now deemed so illegitimate that the people who felt themselves aggrieved were left with nowhere else to turn. And there is the recipe for a wrath that I think is ongoing, although we will have to wait and see what happens in the midterm elections this fall to determine whether it's going to revert back to anger or the wrath will redouble upon itself.
Right. So to follow up on what you're saying, one of the distinctions I've made between the anger and the wrath expressed by, let's say, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, for example, and the anger that you find expressed on the right, and there is anger on the right. And in all fairness, you do talk about that, and you acknowledge that. Is that the folks on the right aren't really going around the country raising buildings and destroying, vandalizing small businesses, and shutting down, burning down police stations. The one exception I probably could make, and it's not even qualitatively speaking an accurate one, but was January 6th. So was January 6th and what we witnessed happening on the Capitol, was that a sort of a culmination of feelings that were bottled up that were somehow unleashed on this one day that in some sense doesn't necessarily, of course, is not the equivalent of a year of vandalism and larceny and so on and so forth. But what were your thoughts about the January 6th in terms of wrath and anger?
Well, January 6th is a very complex event, and because it was a somewhat amorphous mass of people, I suspect that one could find a great range of emotions in play at that event among those who participated. We see videos of people wandering around the Capitol more or less as tourists, not displaying any particular emotion at all other than a kind of giddy pleasure. We see other people with fierce expressions on their face and sneering and something that looks to me very much like anger. Some of it is in that category of what I call the new anger, the performance. The QAnon shaman, when you see him talking, doesn't seem angry, but he's dressed up in an ostentatious way meant to display a kind of belligerence. So there's anger there, too. And then there are those who were deliberately flouting the law, charging at police barricades and that sort of thing, who probably could accurately be described as engaged in rage. What I would stop short of, though, is saying that the January 6th gathering that became a riot of sorts was not itself an event motivated by rage. A number of the participants surely were rageful, but many were not, and it was a recategorization of the event by the press and by political leaders that turned it in after the fact into something that was analogous to the BLM and Antifa riots of the summer of 2020. as you say, there was no significant destruction of property on January 6th. There was the intrusion across police barricades in some cases. In other cases, the Capitol Police simply let people in. There was no bloodshed initiated by the protesters. Instead, we had at least one and probably two cases of protesters murdered by Capitol Hill police. The stories that came out afterwards about violence against the police, well, in some cases, those were justified. People swung fists or other objects at police. So violence was entailed, but nowhere near the level of the what I call the 1619 riots. That's a term picked up from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was happy to call the summer of 1620 as 1619 riots. Those, some 24 people were killed, including policemen and owners of small shops and that sort of thing. Billions of dollars in damage was inflicted. So there's a disparity between the two episodes, the summer riots and the Capitol invasion, which makes them incomparable in most ways. Now, that's not to deny that the right is experiencing anger and verging on wrath. I think it is, but the distinction between left and right here is a fairly deep one. Something very different occurred with the participants in those summer riots than occurred on Capitol Hill.
And I want to take that up because I want to get at the heart of what you call performative anger, which seems to be something quite different than inhabiting anger. But we're going to take a very, very short break and come back to that discussion. Welcome back. We're talking to Peter Wood, who is the author of Wrath, America Engaged, and is also president of the National Association of Scholars. Dr. Wood, we ended talking about the qualitative distinction, among other things, between the riots that have taken place that took place in 2020, initiated by Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and what happened on January 6th. My question to you, Dr. Wood, is the performative nature of anger that you talk about is very, very different than a sort of anger that I don't know if it inhabits one or one inhabits it or one is possessed by it like a demon. But they're different. And I wonder if you could sort of link January 6th to that. But first talk about the difference between a performative anger and a different kind of anger that you see, that you call angry culture today, which seems to be quite different. What's the difference between the two?
Well, I think one has to start with the idea that anger is a normal part of the range of human emotions, and that all humans and probably most other animals are capable of experience anger of some sort. It has to do with body chemistry, among other things, but the anger that humans generally experience occurs as a response to perceived danger or aggravation of some sort, a wounded sense of integrity. It becomes a trigger for some kind of response in people. But the kind of response that one gives to anger varies according to social conditioning, among other things, but also personal temperament. So some people, when they get angry, scream and yell. Some turn to fisticuffs. Some become morose and turn away. The way in which we express anger or feel anger, and that's a distinction that needs to be kept, those are socially patterned in remarkably effective ways. For most of American history, anger was regarded as a pretty dangerous thing to play with. People could get angry in public, and they could brawl and bluster and so on. It was generally viewed as a sign of immaturity if you lack the capacity to control your anger and put it in place. Now, there were strong religious prohibitions against letting anger take control of your life. There are lots of social taboos. Young married couples were usually counseled on how to maintain their cool when dealing with each other, and that people were likely to find that the love and companionship of marriage would break down into fierce fights at some point, and we needed to be prepared for that. Parents were taught how to instill in their children that sense of self-control. Well, many of us still have a sense of self-control, and we don't let anger tear us into a rage every time somebody cuts in front of us in the supermarket or cuts us off on the highway. Also, some of us do. The performative anger is something else altogether. That is that desire to show off anger, even if you don't feel it. And sometimes it becomes really hard to tell whether the person who is engaged in such expression is feeling it or not. Back in the 1980s, the genteel sport of tennis was upset when Mr. McEnroe started throwing his racket around and screaming at the refs when he got a bad call. That was new to tennis, and there was a great puzzle posed. Was this man simply out of control in his anger, or was he showing off in some sort of fashion? We have since learned that showing off anger can be a very rewarding experience for people. They attract a crowd that oftentimes praises them. People judge one another on the basis of how well performed their anger may be. We have whole genres of entertainment now that turn on the issue of how well people can express their rage against others, whether they're feeling it or not. At one point in my investigation of this, I started paying attention to what was going on at the street level, where you could find people who were adorned in what I would call the dress of anger. They would go out onto the street wearing clothes or adorning themselves with sort of minor body mutilations, all of which bespoke kind of drastic disdain for society and for other people around them. But then you could talk to them and find they weren't experiencing anger in any form at all. You could perform anger in a kind of passive way by dressing the part or wearing the part rather than feeling the part. So performative anger gives you the opportunity to show anger without feeling it. Real anger doesn't give you that choice. You can try to repress it, can try to steer it away from a nasty expression of yourself, but anger is anger. So now we have a distinction that involves performative anger, which could be real, or it could be a masquerade. And more often than not, it is a masquerade. We have the public figures who can shake their fist and scream and foam for a few moments on camera, and in the next instant are chatting amiably with their entourage, as though nothing really just happened. So that, I think, is part of the picture that we have to take account of. Our politics now is filled with this performative anger, sometimes spilling into a real anger, but oftentimes we're left not to know. When Nancy Pelosi tore up Trump's State of the Union speech on camera, I would think of that as performative anger, not as spontaneous gesture, something that she probably planned in advance, and it was a way of showing contempt for the President of the United States in a manner that would be conveyed easily to a mass audience. It wasn't, I'm so upset with this man and is saying I'm going to spontaneously destroy my copy of the speech for the world to see.
Right. So the thing that comes to mind is at what point in our history did the taboo against anger dissipate? This ceased to be regarded as some form of moral opprobrium and turn into a free-for-all form of almost authentic self-expression. When, as you're not just an anthropologist, in reading your book, Harry, you're historian as well, and at what point in our history did this taboo sort of dissipate?
Well, I think it began to dissipate in the years just after World War II. I've made this claim multiple times, and so far nobody's challenged me on it, so I will continue to make it. I think two things happened in the wake of World War II. One of them was that America imported psychoanalysis in a way much more serious than it had before. A very fringe number of Americans were acquainted with it before the war. After the war, it became mainstream. It shows up in movies and books and that sort of thing. Psychoanalysis has as one of its component points that if you repress your anger, it's going to come back at you as neurosis. That's straight Freud. So in a certain sense, holding back your anger, restraining it, learning this art of self-control that had been a key ethic of American life for centuries before that, is now suddenly seen as injurious to your mental health. So it is much healthier, and that's the word that gets used, to express your anger than to hold it back. Now, you can't preach that to a mass audience and have it instantly accepted. People learn their emotional habits in childhood, but beginning in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the American elite begins to catch on to this idea. It's a coastal elite. You find it heavily in New York. Partisan Review celebrates it. We're into a world now where those who are in the know that it's a bad idea to repress your anger. Well, that's one of two factors. The other one is that in the wake of the Second World War, Americans picked up on French existentialism, which brings in the theme that to be authentic, to be your true self, you need to liberate your repressed emotions. So authenticity requires letting your anger out. Now, one might think that authenticity could apply to other emotions as well, to kindness, to loving, or something like that, but that's not really the point. The existentialists teach us that when you get drilled down to your truest self, it's going to be an angry self that emerges. And so with that comes in as well. I find a very popular book that was first published in 1951 to be a kind of synthesis of these two things, the psychoanalysis, mental health aspect, and the raging course of authenticity. It's Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, which is ostensibly a story about a dropout from a prep school who goes and spends a few days wandering around New York City. Not until the last chapter of the book is it revealed the story that Holden Caulfield, the little boy, is telling is actually his confession on his psychoanalyst couch. Holden Caulfield's great complaint against adult society and against everybody else is that it's phony. It lacks authenticity. So there you have it in one compact book that can be read by eventually millions of Americans. The psychoanalytic call for letting your emotions out and the need for authenticity are synthesized into one neat little fable. Well, of course, Salinger is far from the only person who is singing from that hymn book, but he's one of the first, and he helps popularize this to a mass audience beyond the readers of, say, Partisan Review.
As you're talking, a couple of things are just coming to my mind. My mind bombarded with these questions, but so I have two follow-up questions I want to ask you. One is the issue in which anger has become medicalized and seen as a medical issue as opposed to a moral issue. But you talk about feelings and authenticity and the importation of French existentialism and psychoanalysis into the sensibilities and the consciousness of Americans. People, yeah, I think people are a lot of people. I see it in my students. I see it in the Z generation especially. People are defined by their feelings. As an anthropologist, as an intellectual, as a trained historian, what do you think, Dr. Wood, is a proper criterion for self-definition? Because feelings are ephemeral and fleeting. What, in your view, this is a question that has plagued philosophers, of course, but I'm going to ask you as an anthropologist, what's a proper criterion, or what are the criteria for self-definition?
Well, I've never been asked that question before, so I'll take this on the wing. The search for one's self probably has to be grounded first in one's idea of a family, a community, people around one who respond to who you are, and that brings a whole host of complications into it. But no one is living a Robinson Crusoe life in which the questions of my personal identity intrude in any significant way. One worries about who one is in relation to the people around you and how they respond to you, how you respond to them. The most important people around you, for most of us anyway, is the nuclear family, how you relate to your parents and to your siblings, and then to a broader circle of relations, aunts, uncles, grandparents, grandchildren, and so on. That's the matrix in which people are defined initially, and while there is within that this maturation that goes on from early years into the teens, in which the child grows into a person who has to define something distinct from his parents and other relatives to get to that sense of being a full owner of one's own self. And that's a somewhat traumatic experience for most people, not a seamless flow from being part of the family to being an individual. But the other elements that come into play are inevitably questions of crucial moral decisions, crucial intellectual decisions. And if it's not already embedded into those two, crucial religious decisions. One has to, as a teenager, becoming aware of a certain degree of autonomy from the family, decide what laws are you going to obey? What is it in the world that is demanded of you that you're going to take seriously? What do you take seriously of your own weight? People will tempt you as a teenager to do things which you have a sense you ought not to do, and you make crucial decisions then. We have in our literature probably an innumerable number of stories that deal with that period in life in which people make these original self-defining decisions. The question of how much those are purely moral and how much they are intellectual, I think probably varies a good bit from person to person. Many of us are affected by the things we read or maybe the movies we watch, but also if we are attentive to a church that we attend or a community of people around us who are intent on promoting a particular view of the world, all of that is going to enter into our sense of who we are. There are myriad of ways in which we can go wrong in those instances and fall under the influence of people or doctrines that are highly destructive. Now, as an anthropologist, of course, I have to spend a fair amount of time exercising a degree of cultural relativism. The child in Soviet Union brought up to believe that denouncing his parents to the secret police is a morally good thing to do is no doubt captivated by that belief and accepts the rewards of the state when he turns in his dad as someone who doesn't like Mr. Stalin. But at the same time, I'm quite aware that these are mistakes in a way, that the moral center can be displaced by doctrines that require people to do things that are fundamentally wrong, and it takes quite a while for people to recover from those mistakes. But there is something like a natural law that is in play. I spent a fair amount of my life studying in some depth ethnographies of people living in remote communities in Highland New Guinea and other parts of the world where the moral ethos of the community is something that we Westerners might find repugnant. But here's an example from one of the most famous anthropologists in the world even today, which is Margaret Mead, who tells the story of a tribe in northern New Guinea called the Chimboli, who were renowned headhunters. But she depicts the men of this community as rather passive and somewhat effeminate, her words, and rather than go out and risk their own skins in warfare with neighboring tribes, their usual practice was to buy captives from neighboring tribes and taking them in bondage back home, tying them to a post, and having their young children run them through with a spear. So indoctrination into manhood, into being a respectable member of the tribe, involved taking a child and traumatizing him by making him commit public murder. Now, Margaret Mead takes that as sort of in passing. That's what they did, so that's their way of going about things. I take it that to turn a child into a killer requires destroying something in that child's soul. The sense that life is precious really belongs to everybody, and it has to be forcibly removed by somebody through an act that I think would properly be called child abuse. Now, in the world of anthropology, we don't get to say things like that. But since I've stepped outside the world of anthropology and am doing some hybrid of my own of history and anthropology and philosophy, I'm willing to say that the formation of character is something that can be distorted by a society, can maybe even be destroyed in some people by society, but there is nonetheless a moral center that we all know is there. There is a fundamental recognition in the human being that some things are just bad to do, and we ought not to do them. How does this get us back to anger? Well, to defy what we know is the right way to lead your life makes you into an angry person. And that I think is why in most of our literature, the villains, people who are given to the pursuit of evil or to the gratification of their baser instincts, are almost always depicted as angry people. The search for a sense of individual character that has something to do with goodness results in that desire to overcome anger, to at least get it under control, and to channel it to those places where it can be constructive, which may have to do with fighting back against the evils of this world.
You're listening to the Jason Hill Show. I'm Jason Hill. Our guest today is Dr. Peter Wood. He's the author of Wrath, American Gauge, and we'll be back in a few moments. Dr. Wood, I want to turn a little bit to the historical section of your book, which I just found, as a history buff myself, fascinating. Now, we want to incentivize readers to buy your book. We're not going to give away too much of the book and talk. I like to talk around the book and around the issues pertaining to the book, but the readers definitely should buy this book if they want a good historical grasp on looking at how anger and the expression of anger formed the sensibilities of people in the 19th century, this 18th century. So you do a really wonderful job of talking about George Washington, which I'm not going to have you talk about because then nobody would buy the book. But my question for you is a more generic one. And it's, aside from Washington, in your view, who among the founding fathers was motivated by what we would call a form of anger that Aristotle referred to as righteous indignation. And to what extent do you think that form of anger was constitutive, was necessary for the formation of our republic?
Well, let's take Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence, past the opening paragraph of it, is a list of 20-some grievances against the crown. They are, in essence, indignation written out. Some of them are quite exaggerated. Historians can look at them and say, well, that's not really what was going on. But Jefferson was willing to list them all out. Now, was he doing that because he wanted to accurately reflect all of the issues that had been brought up by his fellow patriots, or was this something that he had felt through? Now, I think there may be historians who give a better answer to that than I can, but I would say that we find in Jefferson a consummate rationalist in many ways, who was also someone who was pretty passionate in his dissent from the rule by King George. So I would put him on the list. He's not discussed in my book, or any of my books, so that's off the cuff. We have other figures in the American Revolution, maybe not usually in the category of founders, but Thomas Paine is certainly someone who gives full vent to the rage of the patriots against the crown. His common sense is, among other things, common anger, writ large and writ vibrantly. He gives a rather nice instance, for example, of how anger can be turned into eloquence, that it gives the fuel to a sense of grievance that now finds its way into vivid and vituperative language, which, to grab an analogy perhaps far afield, much like a lot of hip-hop or rap lyrics, which are not in every case, but in perhaps the great majority of cases, it's anger music. And the eloquence of the people rhyming their grievances in that kind of music is a pretty good instance of, it's not exactly sublimated anger, but to sit down and have to think about and write out such lyrics is quite different from experiencing the anger firsthand. So there's at least a 2 or 3 step process there by which anger becomes eloquence. That's what I see in Thomas Paine's writings.
Right. And so a follow-up question would be, if the founding fathers, in spite of the differences, and we know that, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a great deal of animosity between Jefferson and Adams, right?
For sure, yes.
For sure. And if they could have gotten through and transcended their differences, the multiplicity of differences that were evident, and formed something, one of the most sacred, I say the word particularly sacred, documents in the history of humanity, the American Constitution. Why is it today that individuals on the left and the right are seemingly incapable at this moment in our country's history, incapable of transcending those differences and come to the point where, going back to an old adage, reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements?
Well, Adams and Jefferson probably despised each other, at least after the election of 1800. They eventually got over their differences, but what governed both of them was that they took no pride in being out of control or angry. Their self-esteem was rooted in the sense that they could rise above this. And the great difference between then and now is that people's self-esteem now seems to lie on the side of I can't and I won't rise above this. The disdain that both the left and right feel for the other side these days goes to the core of who we think we are. Now, I don't want to exaggerate historical differences to make them seem as though they're written into human nature. There was a now forgotten but at the time popular poet named Thomas Green Fessenden, who was a partisan of Adams and a extreme detractor for Jefferson right around the beginning of the 19th century. And he wrote one long, almost epic poem denouncing Jefferson. The desire to show off, Fessenden's desire to show off how much he hated Jefferson took the form of an extreme and probably rather silly labor. But there it was. There was someone who was engaged in something like what I call new anger, this show-offy performative anger. But Fessenden made no mark in the world. He came and went, and if he's remembered at all now, it's because he was the editor of one of the first farmers' almanacs in the U.S. But back to our own time, these days, you can make a career out of being angry and expressing that anger in the most extreme way you can. We have 2 TV networks, or maybe 1.5 now, with MSNBC and CNN, that devoted years of broadcasting to a kind of constant sneer to the other side. Well, the people who were hired to perform those roles, who knows what they were privately thinking, but I tend to take them at their word. They believed what they were saying at the time, and maybe still do. Were in no position to go looking for an olive branch. It would have destroyed their careers had they done so. It also was a matter of by constantly stoking the flames of outrage against the other side, they were stoking the other side's outrage against them. The world in which we live now is one in which people would be ashamed to admit that they were ready to seek conciliation with people of the other view. Now, I happen to live in the Upper West Side of New York City, where I'm one of very few people in my neighborhood who probably voted for Trump, and who even fewer of us would be willing to be as outspoken as I am in upholding the kinds of views that I'm expressing now. And yet I get along perfectly well with my neighbors. That happens because I simply avoid confrontation. I don't talk about these matters with my neighbors. I talk about them instead with Jason Hill. And that works because none of my neighbors are tuning into the Jason Hill show or looking at the websites where day after day I'm publishing articles. That bifurcation of our society into these 2 categories of people who either don't communicate with each other at all or who communicate with each other in very circumspect ways, I think is part of the condition that leads to this sense that conciliation between left and right is well nigh impossible at this point. Now,
And it,
go ahead.
yeah, and it speaks wonderfully to a term that you use, which I love. I made note of it in my journal, called public etiquette. And is this the best that we can hope to achieve? Public etiquette is to sort of keep the conversations, to keep our lives compartmentalized in a particular kind of way politically, so that we do have some sort of civic trust and social cohesion and the maintenance of what you call public etiquette in our social lives.
Um, Well, I'm going to allow that there are a bunch of organizations now that are aiming for something better than that. There's one called Braver Angels that tries to bring together people on both sides and get them to talk to one another openly about their differences, but in a manner where they don't vituperate. Now, Braver Angels goes around the country and stages these events, and I read their stuff and I see that they can make a fair claim to a certain amount of success, although they're dealing usually with no more than a few dozen people in any given city, and it's not something that's changing the temperament of the culture. It's just perhaps enlightening a handful of individuals. Well, culture changes somehow, and perhaps it starts with these very small events. So I'm not willing to say that all is lost, that we cannot recover our better sense of who we are and how we should lead our lives. That's me speaking sort of Christian optimism, which I profess. But me speaking as the professional social scientist, I would see the dynamic right now is quite different. We are not headed towards a moment where the light will shine in all our eyes, that we could do a better job. I think rather we're headed towards a more dramatic confrontation in a world in which there really is no middle ground to be found between the two sides of the present culture war. And it's something of an illusion to think that the answer is to be found by some kind of kumbaya moment. It isn't going to happen. Rather, in the culture war, what happens historically is that one side wins and one side loses. To the extent the American Revolution had a culture war going on, the loyalists lost. They either went to Canada or some of them went back to England, or they settled down to a life in which they were on the path to historical oblivion, even if they could hold on to their property for another generation or so. That's what we're faced with now. Now, the American left thinks it's going to win this war, and it's got its chess pieces lined up to do exactly that. That might involve further electoral manipulation. It certainly involves using the powers of the federal government, the FBI, the now actually armed IRS with its many thousands more agents. All of that is being weaponized against those citizens of the United States and members of the Republic who disagree with the worldview that the left has put on offer. We are supposed to be participating in the rise of a new world order, which has a variety of components, some of which probably lie beyond this conversation, but they include things like turning the global warming into an existential crisis that requires the elimination of fossil fuels and therefore the impoverishment of ordinary Americans in the third world. It involves other elements that have to do with who should be allowed access to guns, armaments. The world in which we're living divides along a very crisp line there. One side says we are rightfully in control, and we are going to use the powers that are available to us to maintain that control up to the point of incarcerating or even killing our enemies. The other side, the right in America, is much more diffident about what it should do. It's easy to find people who are kind of hot-headed about it and say, they hold up the flag with the come and get it motto on it, that they're ready to fight for their rights to their death. But that's rhetoric at this point, and it's not backed by any instance in which we see the conservatives rising up into armed rebellion in this country. Could come to that, but it hasn't come anywhere near it yet. The difference here, I really want to get in this point and having trouble getting to it, is that the anger of the left and right is not symmetrical. The new anger, this performative anger, much more easily found a home on the political left. It blew up in remarkable ways during the early years of George W. Bush's presidency, where it was easily found as a recourse to say that the 2000 election was stolen, that President Bush was some kind of moron that needed to be taken out. There were published fantasies about assassinating him that could find expression in the pages of things like the New Yorker and the New York Times. That kind of readiness to engage in violent fantasy about destruction of the other side was new anger finding its political formulation in this country. And it certainly continued on through the justifications of attempts to delegitimate Trump's presidency by characterizing him as a stooge or an agent of Vladimir Putin. And on we went to a world in which there were very few restraints on the left's anger at having lost power in an election that it believed it was its hold on to. So that led in turn to the various forms of mischief that took place in the 2020 election. And it's left to this sense of the American right being not simply deposed from any legitimate role in the governance of the country, but being deposed from any legitimate sense of emotion over its losses. So the angry left is angry because it sees its legitimate hold on power to be stymied by the deplorables, as Hillary called them. The angry right feels aggrieved because its trust in American institutions has been betrayed. The sense that we elect our leaders, our sense of thinking that there is a rule of law that applies to all equally, has been stolen away in a fashion that they just don't know how to get back to. And that's a dangerous position to be in. I say it's not new anger because it's not especially performative, though it has some performative edges to it, but it takes us very close to what happens when you aren't able to express anger, and that's back to the title of the book, Wrath.
Well, let's end on a particular note that I want to sort of leave our listeners with, and it's not a disingenuous move on my part by any means, but you talk about anger as, of course, having a moral upshot to it, and there's a rich section in your book, a historical section that talks about, and we've broached this in the interview, the extent to which the anger and of the founding fathers against the crown, in some sense, gave birth to this magnificent, unprecedented republic that we have. In closing, let me ask you this, Dr. Wood: how do we not divest ourselves or expurgate ourselves of this anger that is a basic human emotion that responds to injustice? But how, in your view, would you like to see us proceed in terms of how we utilize our anger, justified or not, in terms of shaping the republic as the republic, assuming that we can continue to keep a republic, but the republic as it continues to go? As an anthropologist, how would you like to see us utilize that anger?
I would like to see us adopt a fierce regard for the rule of law, that we can take our anger into a public place and use it constructively to insist that the laws be upheld, that the laws themselves be righteous laws, not something that is improvised in the moment for the advantage of one party or another. We know how to do that because we did it for 200 years. Not every law is perfectly framed, so we have a process that allows laws to be modified and changed or repealed. That's a good thing. And we have a court system that has, when it's worked well, has winnowed the laws to make sure that they're in accord with our constitutional principles. We can achieve this, however, only if Americans actually know what their own traditions are. That is, takes us back into the world of education where my feet are planted. We need young children to learn from an early age how self-governing people go about creating the institutions and sustaining those institutions on which they make sure that the rights of other people are respected and that we are capable of dealing with the people who break laws in a humane but just manner. That becomes something that must be carried on through higher education and through the other institutions of a civilized society. We need to be, in other words, to have that educated citizenry that Jefferson believed was crucial for the sustenance of a republic like this. Nothing has changed about that. The formulas which our founding fathers put in play remain the ones that are going to be our only hope for a better, just, and peaceable republic.
My guest has been Dr. Peter Wood, the author of Wrath, American Enraged. Dr. Wood, thank you so much for appearing on the show. Can you tell our listeners where they can find your work? I'm sure your book is on Amazon, but elsewhere, and if you're on Twitter, or how else they can contact or learn more about you?
Well, I'm not on Twitter, or at least I wasn't till yesterday, where I just created an account. My books are all published by Encounter Books, encounterbooks.com, available there. Like we said, they're available from Amazon and mostly from Barnes & Noble, although I rarely actually get physical copies into a bookstore. I publish widely. A lot of my work is linked on the National Association of Scholars website. That's nas.org. I'm a frequent contributor these days to the magazine Spectator, where you can find some of my writings.
Well, we'll have to have you. What's your Twitter handle, by the way, if you don't mind sharing that?
No, you caught me unawares. I don't know what my Twitter handle is.
Well, I'm sure our listeners will just type in Peter Wood and they'll find you. We'll have to have you back on to talk about your book 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project, because there are a host of issues that I'd love to talk to you about. But thank you so very much for joining me on this show. I appreciate it, and I look forward to more conversations with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
The Jason Hill Show is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.